The purpose of this series has been to help us come to better know God's larger story, as well as to help you and I each come to know and understand our smaller story, so that we can learn to live our smaller story in the context of God's larger story, and in so doing become the character that God intended you to be as a man in the greatest story ever told, which is the story of God. Now the series of the outline, we've really divided it into two parts, God's story and your story. The first three sessions focused on God's story. History is God's story, how God tells a story, and the story God is telling. And then we began to look at your story, how your story was shaped and formed as a boy. Then not all stories are created equal. There are some stories that are healthy and some stories that are unhealthy. And then today, living into God's story. And if you've missed any one of these sessions, you want to hear it again, you can go to the Man-to-Man podcast or to our YouTube channel. As we said, today is the final session, session number 6, living into God's story. But before we get started there, let's just kind of remember where we ended last time. Last time we identified a problem, and that problem is this. Living into God's story isn't as easy as we would think. Remember, we're wanting to move our story into God's larger story, so that we are living in His story. And one of the things we said is, while it's easy to conceptualize, it isn't as easy to live and to do as we think. And the reason for that is many of us attempt to bring our unhealthy, smaller story into God's larger story. And that doesn't work. And you say, well, what is an unhealthy story? Remember, we looked at that. We said an unhealthy story is marked by several things. First of all, self-deception. I make my own truth. Second, self-absorption. Only my story matters. I'm the point. Third, self-defeat. My choices don't matter. It's all fate. No matter what I do, it's all going to turn out the way it's supposed to turn out, or the way other powers are, so why even try? And then self-delusion. I must be in control of my life. Now, these marks then trap our lives in several things. Frustration. Nothing ever works the way I want it to work or lasts the way I would like it to last. Confusion. I don't know who I am or what I'm about or what I want. Shame. Something is wrong with me. Isolation. I'm alone and disconnected in this world. And despair. My life has no meaning or hope. Now, that is the mark of an unhealthy story. And so many men live in this kind of a story, and they try to bring this story into God's story, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Now contrast that with a healthy story. A healthy story is marked by truth. I see life as corresponding to reality. Energy, this truth, as I see life corresponding to reality, frees me and motivates me to set me free. Grace towards myself and towards others allows risk without shame or without condemnation. Hope, faith that my story will have some kind of a good ending. And connectedness. I'm part of a bigger community, and my life is part of a larger story. Now that, when we live with that as marks of our lives, it gives our lives purpose. I know why I'm here. It gives our lives direction. I know where my life is supposed to go. It gives my life a sense of power. I can make a difference in this world. And it gives me a sense of love. What matters is blessing others, not living for myself, not taking from others. And all this gives me a sense of peace in my life. My life has meaning and significance. And we concluded last session that because unhealthy stories traps us in a life that really is stuck and going nowhere, they need to be exchanged for another story, a different story, a new story that gives our life a sense of hope and direction and meaning and movement. How many of us want a story like that, a life that's lived like that? Well, what we said then, if that's what you want, you can have a different story, you can have a new story by exchanging your smaller story for the larger story of God. It's only as we exchange our smaller story for God's larger story that we can begin to live into God's story. And we ended with this question. Well, if that's true, then how can I exchange my unhealthy story for God's story? What do I need to do? How do I do that? What needs to change in my life that I can let go of this story that I feel trapped in to live in a story that gives me a sense of hope and purpose and security and a forward movement? How do I do that? Well, that's what we want to deal with today. To exchange an unhealthy story for God's story, we're going to have to do three things. We're going to focus on these three things today. First, we're going to have to begin to rethink our understanding of the Christian life. Okay? Second, we're going to have to recognize our present situation, whatever your situation is today, there's something bigger going on around it. Okay? It's part of something bigger, whether you see it or not. And third, we have to begin to learn to reinterpret our past from the context of God's larger story. We don't change our past, but we learn to reinterpret what our past means in light of God's larger story instead of my smaller story. Okay? So those three things we're going to look at today. So first, to live into God's story, we need to first begin to rethink our understanding of Christianity and the Christian life. Okay? Now, if you ask the average man today, what is Christianity and the Christian life all about? What do you think the standard answer would be? What do you think the basic answer would be? What is Christianity and the Christian life all about? Pardon me?
Be a good guy.
Be a good guy? Okay. Anything else?
Act like a Christian.
Act like a Christian.
Underline act.
Be a good guy.
Act. There you go. Act.
Okay? I think a standard answer you probably get, and it's what you hear all the time, is it's about receiving Jesus as your personal Savior so your sins can be forgiven and then you can go to heaven when you die. That's kind of the standard answer. And if you don't believe that, just look at bumper sticker theology. Where did that go? Did I miss that? Okay. In other words, for many Christian men, Christianity is about one thing: forgiveness, something I secure now here on earth that I will enjoy later in heaven after I die. And the Christian life then, if that's what Christianity is about, then the Christian life is waiting for this other worldly hope of heaven, which I try to hold on to by being what? A good guy. Okay? And if you don't believe it's about those two things, again, just look at the bumper stickers. I call it bumper sticker theology. Christians aren't perfect, they're just forgiven. Why? Because Christianity is all about forgiveness. And in case of an emergency, in case of the rapture, this car will be unmanned. Looks like it's already been unmanned for a few times there. All beat up. What's that saying?
Unpersoned.
Yeah, what's that saying? It's saying that Christianity is all about forgiveness and waiting for the rapture so that you can go to heaven when you die. And be a good guy to make sure that you hold on to that. Now, two questions. Is this an accurate understanding of Christianity and the Christian life, forgiveness and being a good guy to go to heaven? And is an accurate understanding necessary for you and me to live into God's story?
Yes.
And if so, why? Well, first question. Is this an accurate understanding of Christianity and the Christian life? Answer that I would give is no, not at all. Why not? Well, first of all, it promotes a limited understanding of Christianity and the Christian life. Christianity includes forgiveness, it includes heaven, but it's much more than that. Christianity is more than forgiveness, and the Christian life is more than waiting and being good. Okay? It's more than that. So it's a limited understanding. Second, it makes my story, my smaller story, the main point in which God exists to play a supporting role. Why? Because it's all about me getting what I want to have a good future. And what we see is Christianity is bigger than my agenda, and the Christian life is not about God serving me. Rather, it's about what? Me serving God. Third, it views Christianity as a proposition I agree to. It's like a contract I enter into. Do you believe this? Yes, and sign on the dotted line, while ignoring its place or its roots in the Old Testament story, the promises that connect together to form a story. What we see is that Christianity launches the Old Testament stories of the good ending that's coming. The Old Testament has been promising since the Genesis 3, it started to promise that God has not given up on his fallen creation, but he is going to do something different. He is going to make it new. And everything throughout the Old Testament is forming that story. And when you get to the New Testament, and when you get to Jesus, his death and his resurrection, this launches the Old Testament story's good end. And the Christian life then is about advancing the story to its good end. It's about advancing the plot, not about heaven when I die. You see this in the book of Ephesians. Now what I want to do is I want to just take a 30,000-foot view of Ephesians, and then I want to look at how Paul begins the book. First of all, the book of Ephesians, 6 chapters. Chapters 1 through 3, if you read it, it says in essence this. This is what God has done in creation and for humanity through Jesus Christ. And the word I use the Messiah there because Paul uses the word Christ. Christ is the Greek word for the Hebrew word Messiah. Messiah refers back to the promises God made to Israel that he would make all things new someday through who? The Messiah. And so the Messiah links us back to the story. This is what God has done in creation and for humanity through the promised Messiah. In essence, what he's saying is, this is the essence of Christianity. This is what it's all about. And then chapters 4 through 6, he says, this is how to live in creation and with humanity in light of what God has done through Messiah. This then is the nature of the Christian life. So chapters 1 through 3, this is what Christianity is. Chapters 4 through 6, this is the nature of the Christian life. Okay? Now, watch in how the book begins. In chapter 1, verses 9 through 11, and this is kind of an interpretive paraphrase, Paul says this. Through the gospel, God has now fully revealed to us his mysterious plan for creation. Remember, it was broken. God has a plan, and it's mysterious. It's been hidden. It hasn't been right out there for everybody to see. It's coming in the back door and having different ways of going to and fro. With regards to Israel's promised Messiah, this plan which God will fulfill when his goal for human history is finally complete, the end of the story, is to bring together heaven and earth under the authority of the kingly reign of Messiah. Now watch what he says. In whom, in the Messiah, we were also chosen to be part of God's family, having been appointed to take part in his plan. What's he saying here? Well, notice, this first section, he is describing Christianity, chapters 1 through 3. This is the theme that he's going to be talking about in chapters 1 through 3. But what does he talk about in chapters 4 through 6? The Christian life. And so guess what? After mentioning in this introduction, this is what Christianity is, what is he going to talk about? The Christian life, in whom we were also chosen to be part of God's family, having been appointed to do what? Take part in his plan. That's what chapters 4 through 6 are about. Now watch this too. This first part that we have here in blue, if you've been here in the past, what does that sound like? God's plan, human history. What does it sound like? God's story. And what does this second part sound like? The part that's in orange. Living in God's story. What do you see here? What we see is this. We've been talking about God's larger story and your story, smaller story. Now we're talking about our Christian life, Christianity and the Christian life. Where does Christianity and your Christian life fit into all of this? Is it just two separate things? Here's God's story over here, and here's the Christian story over here, my Christian life and my Christianity over here, and never the two shall meet? Where does Christianity and your Christian life fit into all this that we've been talking about? I'll show you. Right there. It's the climactic chapter in God's story. And so that your smaller story then moves into God's story through faith in Jesus. When you trust Jesus as your Savior so that your sins can be forgiven so that you can go to heaven when you die, you're brought into God's story. And as you live in God's story, guess what? That's the Christian life. It's participating in the story of God. It's advancing the plot of God's story. In other words, God's story and Christianity, being a character in God's story and the Christian life, are two sides of the same coin. We're talking about the same thing. And so then, question number 1, is waiting for an otherworldly hope secured by forgiveness through faith in Jesus an accurate understanding of Christianity and the Christian life? Answer? No. Why? It has a limited understanding of Christianity and the Christian life. It makes my story the main point instead of God's story being the main point. And it ignores its place in the Old Testament story. It looks at Christianity as a proposition. I sign on the dotted line and I agree to that. Second question, is an accurate understanding, is it important that I see my Christian life and Christianity as the same side of the same coin of God's story and participating as a character in God's story? Is that necessary for living into God's story? Answer? Yes. Why? Well, think with me. Just as you can't effectively participate in a football game as a right guard without an understanding of the game of football and the role of right guard. How many of you ever played football? I played football beginning in 7th grade all the way through high school. And at the time, I was bigger than most guys, and so my coach, I never played football. Everybody else played this peewee football, remember that? You know, bantamweight or whatever, and my mom wouldn't let me play because she was always afraid. I had braces, she was always afraid I'd mess up my teeth, so they didn't let me play. But when I got into 7th grade, my coach, the 7th grade coach, he recruited me. And my mom had nothing to say about it then. And so anyway, I didn't know. Never played a game of football, never watched football. So he said, you're gonna play right guard. And okay. So when they hiked the ball, I didn't know what to do, so you know what I did? I went and tackled the guy in front of me. Why? I had no idea what the game of football was about, and I had no idea what my role as right guard would play. Now, fortunately, my coach was gracious, and he helped me learn. I played right guard all the way through high school. But just as you won't understand, you can't participate in football as a right guard without understanding the game of football and the role of right guard, so also we can't effectively participate in God's story as a supporting character without an understanding of Christianity and the role of the Christian life, and vice versa. We can't effectively participate in Christianity and live the Christian life without what? An understanding of God's story and your role as a supporting character. Why? Because they're two sides of the same coin. For example, let me show you this. Why this is necessary. Why we can't participate in God's story without understanding Christianity and what it means to live the Christian life. In 1 Corinthians 9, 23 through 27, Paul says this. He's talking about his own personal life in light of he's been sharing with the Corinthians about their lives. He says, I live my whole life for the sake of the gospel because I want to participate in its blessings. All athletes are self-disciplined in their training. They do it to receive a perishable crown, but we an imperishable. He's talking about what? At the end of the race, this is what they receive. Like a winning athlete, I run with purpose in every step, and I don't just box as one swinging wildly in the air. Rather, I discipline my body, training it to do what it should, so I won't be disqualified after telling the good news to others. Now, what in the world is Paul talking about here? What is he saying here? Well, if you back up again, go to the 30,000 feet, and look at the larger context of the whole book of Corinthians. Throughout the letter of Corinthians, Paul is addressing various problems that the believers in Corinth were struggling with. Sex, immorality, marriage, eating food offered to idols, conscience, the Lord's table, lots of different things. But he addresses each of those things not from a moral perspective, well, you should do this and you shouldn't do this because this is right and this is wrong, but from the perspective of God's larger story. In other words, each issue that he deals with, he says, let's think about this in the context of something bigger, which he's driving at all the way to the end of Corinthians chapter 15, which he talks about the resurrection and all things being brought in subjection to Jesus. And he's doing this, he's addressing the Corinthians like this because as Christians, the Corinthians were living like characters lost in a larger story whose plot they didn't understand. They were involved in a football game, playing the role of right guard, but having no idea what football was or what the role of right guard was. They're just confused about all of this. And so Paul's solution isn't, again, to give them lessons in morality, stop this and do this, because this is right and this is wrong. Paul addresses their problems by reframing each within God's story and then reframing them as participants in God's story. Your body isn't for yourself, he says. Your body is for the Lord, and the Lord is going to raise it up, and it has purpose and meaning in God's larger story. And so when he comes to chapter 8 through 10, and this is where Paul now is talking, this passage we looked at, Paul refrains the exercise of their personal freedoms and rights in regards to eating meat offered to idols with their relationships with Jews, Gentiles, believers in the context, again, of God's larger story. And set in this context, let me give you an interpretive paraphrase, what I think he is in essence saying. In other words, if we're looking from 30,000 feet at this section that we just read from Paul, Paul is giving his own personal experience. This is, I think it would sound something like this. He says, everything I do and don't do is determined by what best advances God's story, not mine. Why? Because he's the point, not me. For this reason, my whole life is lived as a supporting character, moving God's plot forward to its good ending, resurrection and the new creation. Which, by the way, again, he's going to really talk about in chapter 15. Living as a supporting character, however, isn't easy. It's hard. It requires giving up main character status to advance the story of another. It's not natural that we advance the story of another. It's natural that we advance what? Our own story. So it's hard. Like an athlete who's in it to win, it requires giving up an easy life for a life of strenuous effort and daily discipline. And he says, but I'm in it to win. I want to live for God's story, not mine. Therefore, I do not run without purpose or box without focus. I train my body to give up its rights and privileges as the main character of my story so I can more fully participate with God as a supporting character in his story. What's Paul saying? If we are going to participate with God in his story as a character, if we're going to live into his story with our smaller story, it's necessary what? That we, what? Yeah, that we understand the story, that we have an accurate understanding of the story. So what are we saying? For you and me to participate in God's story, we just can't step in the ring and start swinging and hope it all works out. Yeah, I trusted Jesus, and I'm going to heaven when I die, and I'm trying to be a good guy as I wait for all that to happen, for the rapture to take place. I hope, by being good, I hope it all works out. You're not going to participate, be an active participant in God's story if that's how you're living your life as a Christian man. As Christian men, we must have an accurate understanding of what's going on. That Christianity is about God's story, not our story. And the Christian life is about being a supporting character, not the main character. It's about advancing God's plot, not our own. Which means, again, if we go back to the standard answer, if we think Christianity is simply an otherworldly hope based on forgiveness through faith in Christ, and that the Christian life is about being good or doing good to validate our faith as we wait for heaven, then like a boxer beating the air, we're in the ring but don't know what's going on. And that's a dangerous place to be. And like the Christians, we are aimless characters lost in a story we don't understand. Guys, Paul said, like an athlete, I don't just run. He says, I run to win the race. As Christian men, are we just Christians to go to heaven when we die? Or are we in it to run in a way that allows us to participate in God's story? We'll never be participants in the story. We'll never bring our smaller story to live into God's larger story until we accurately understand what this is all about. What God is doing in creation and the part that we are to play in that story. That's the story of God, and that's what Christianity is all about. And so then, to live into God's story, we must rethink our understanding of Christianity and the Christian life. And if we do that, what we will see is God's story and Christianity are not two separate things. They are what? Two sides of the same coin. So second, to live into God's story, we need to recognize our present situation as part of something bigger. Think of where you're at today. Every one of us, if we would take some time to share, you have a situation that you're presently going through. It may be good, it may be bad, it may be somewhere in between. There's probably some things that are good, some things that are bad, some things that are making you anxious, some things that are making you angry, some things that are making you sad, some things that are making you confused. We're all involved in life today, and it hits us all in a different way. And how it hits us creates different emotions within us. And out of those emotions, we respond to that situation. And what I'm saying is, if we're going to live into God's story, we have to recognize that your present situation is part of something bigger that you don't see or that you may not understand. In 2 Kings 6:15 through 17, it says this: When the servant of the man of God got up early the next morning, this is Elisha he's talking about, the servant, the man of God, and went outside, there were enemy troops, horses and chariots everywhere. So this servant of Elisha wakes up, and he gets up and walks outside to look and see what's going on in the morning, see if the sun is coming up, whatever, and he looks out and all he sees is what? The enemy. Horses, chariots, soldiers, and they're coming after your master, Elisha. And he looks at it and he says, oh man, what I thought was going to be a good day has suddenly turned what? Terrible. Terrible. This is not a good day. Oh, sir, what will we do now? The young man cried out to Elisha. Elisha says, don't be afraid, for there are more on our side than on theirs. So the servant thinks, okay, are you still asleep? Or are you old, or what? Because I look out here and I see all of this, and I look here and I just see us two. So Elisha says, let me pray. And so Elisha prayed, and he says, oh Lord, open my servant's eyes so that he can see. And so the Lord heard the prayer, and he opened the young man's eyes, and when he looked up, that is, when the servant looked up at all the enemy on the hillside, he also sees behind all the enemy, it was filled with horses and chariots of fire, the heavenly host. Good guys who were there all along that he didn't see. Now, 4 observations. Elijah's servant, he's worried about his present situation. And the present situation is very grim, and it's because they are outnumbered by the enemy. Elisha's response, rather than joining in his anxiety, Elisha prays, and he prays for his servant's focus would move from his smaller visible world to God's larger unseen world that was there all along. God's answer, what does he do? He opens the servant's eyes, and God's larger story suddenly comes into view. He sees what was there all along. And the servant's reaction. He is no longer anxious, given this new perspective from which to view his. Everything changes when he becomes aware of the story. Now, how many of us can identify with Elisha's servant? We all can, can't we? Often, we don't see beyond our present situation of the visible world. Again, what's your present situation? So often we look at it and all we can see is that present situation. And that's because we're looking at it from a smaller story perspective. And when we look at it from a smaller story perspective, we believe that our visible world is the only reality there is. There's nothing else going on except what we can see. And so this smaller story perspective turns into a very limited perspective. Now, what does this limited perspective do? Well, this limited perspective tells us that our fate is fixed. That all the enemy out there, they're going to wipe us out. No matter what we do, no matter how hard we try, no matter anything we think of. It's there and we can't change our fate. The present situation is going to take us down. And that causes us to have a powerless perspective. There's nothing we can do. And when you have a powerless perspective, how do you begin to feel, guys? Anxious, worried, fearful, doom. And that powerless perspective then turns into a hopeless perspective. And when you have a hopeless perspective, guess what then happens? It sucks you back into that smaller story perspective. And each time it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And your anxiety level gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Why? Because we're looking at our present situation like Elisha's servant did. There's nothing bigger going on than what we can see. In other words, viewing our present situation from a smaller story perspective, it blinds us to the reality of God's larger story that's going on all around us. It enslaves us to the unsettling circumstances of our present situation. No way you can get away from it. And it robs us of peace and joy and meaning that living in God's story brings. But most of all, what I want you to see is it prevents us from taking our smaller story and moving it into God's larger story so that we're living as Christian men, participating in our Christian lives in that larger story. And so the $10,000 question is, how do we escape our smaller story perspective? Because that's our tendency. That's naturally where we go. Well, I think there's 3 things we can learn to practice. We can learn to practice taking an upward look, taking an outward look, and taking an inward look. Okay? Let's quickly look at these. First, take an upward look. What do I mean by this? Well, when Elisha's servant was blinded to God's story by his present situation, what did Elisha do? What did he do? He prayed. And what did he pray? Lord, open this man's eyes and let him see. Guys, one of the things that we need to begin to practice is asking God to open our eyes and let us see the unseen. To give us eyes of faith so that we can see what is going on around us, what our physical eyes cannot see. Now, there are 3 assumptions in Elisha's prayer when he prays this for his servant. First, God's exclusivity. What do I mean by that? Only God has the power to open our eyes to see his story in our present situation. In other words, it doesn't matter how hard you try or how good you are, I can't force my eyes open to see the unseen. I don't have that capability, and neither do you. None of us do. And so if our eyes are going to be open, the only one that can open our eyes to see the unseen realm is who? God. So our prayers have to be aimed at him. Second, God's kindness. God gladly opens the eyes of anyone who asks to see his invisible story. Why? Because God longs for us to be part of that story. He made us to be part of that story. He's redeeming us to be part of that story. He daily invites us to be part of that story. So God is not only the one that opens our eyes, but He wants to open our eyes. He has the power to do so, and He has the desire to do so. Thirdly, the recipient's heart. What do our hearts have to be like for God to open our eyes? First of all, they have to be distraught over the present situation. And I don't just mean, this is uncomfortable. I mean, you know what, this doesn't work. I hate this. It's always ending up like this. My life is never going anywhere like this. I'll have good days, I'll have bad days, but I'm just stuck. I'm distraught over the present situation, how it controls me, and how it enslaves me, and how it directs my decisions. That then moves you to being discontent with a smaller story perspective. You know what, as long as I live in this smaller story perspective, I'm always going to be distraught over my present situation. There's nowhere I can go. I'm stuck here. I don't want this anymore. I want something more. And so that creates then a desperate longing for something more and something bigger. I want more than this. Rick?
When you're living in your smaller story, you end up being desperate for something like relief or something better, though, right? But when you're living in God's story, you want something bigger.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, well, because if you're living in your smaller story, relief gives you a recess, but guess what you know? The bell is always going to ring. You're going to have to go back. So you're just stuck, and you're always at the mercy of the present situation. That's my point. Yeah, you can't see past it. So I want something more than this.
The heart changes from desperate for relief to desperate for something bigger.
Yes, yes. I don't know what that is, but I know this, God. Only you can give it. And God, I pray that you are merciful, that you would give it. And the good news is God is not only the one that can give it, but He wants it. He wants to give it to us more than we want it ourselves. Second, you got to not only take an upward look, you take an outward look. What's going on around me? Question, what did Elisha's servant experience when he failed to see beyond his present situation? All he could see was his present situation. What did he experience? Fear, anxiety, panic, terror, doom. You can lump those into two things: powerlessness and hopelessness. And guys, when a man feels powerless and when a man feels hopeless, he responds in typical ways. First, I'm going to avoid anything that makes me feel powerless and hopeless. Why? I can't face this. It's too big. Or he gets paralyzed. I can't think. I'm just looking at it and I can't move. I'm stuck. Or he feels shame and contempt. He pours it on himself. Why? Because I should be able to fix this. I can't. No matter what I do, it just doesn't go away. Or he feels rage. I can't cope with this. So what do? I will destroy it. I will attack it. I will make it pay for causing me to feel this way. Guys, all of us respond in one of these four ways. We probably have our favorite one, but there are times when we probably participated in all of them. In Matthew 6, we see these same emotional experiences talked about and addressed. Jesus says this. He says, when you feel anxious and afraid, powerless and hopeless, because of your present situation, he says, take an outward look around you. Remember the passage? Where does he say to look at? First, look at the birds. And what does he say when you look at the birds? He says, look and see how they daily receive all they need from a world directed by God's grace. He says, but not only look at the birds, look also at the flowers that are here today and gone tomorrow. He says they effortlessly exhibit unmatched beauty in a world under God's care. He says, as you look at the birds and as you look at the flowers, notice their response. He says they neither toil nor fret over their present situation because they are sustained by a world under the direct care and direction of a good and present God. Take an outward look at the birds and the flowers. Something small and something temporary. How God cares for them. And then what does Jesus do? Well, he makes his point in verses 26 through 34. He declares this. He says this. We live in a world in which every created thing, small birds and flowers, is under the constant care and direction of a good God that has not abandoned his good but broken creation. God is not off there somewhere. God is here. And he loves his creation, and he's caring for his creation. Look at the birds and look at the flowers. He then applies it to you and me. He says, because humans are not just small birds or temporary flowers, but we are the crown of God's creation. We bear his image. We're made to rule over his creation. On God's behalf, because that's who we are, we can rest assured that our present situation is also under the direct care and direction of God. If he cares for them, they're here today and gone tomorrow. Won't he care for you, the crown of his creation? And then he applies it. He exhorts us this. He says, if we live like creation's crown by making God's kingly reign our primary pursuit, because as image bearers, that's what we're to do, right? Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and everything else will be added. Why do we seek first his kingdom? Because that's what image bearers do. We were here to advance his kingly rule, to advance Messiah's reign. And so he says, if we live like creation's crown by making God's kingly reign our primary pursuit, then we too will experience peace that comes by living from larger perspective of God's unfolding story. He says, the Gentiles who live in their own smaller stories, they worry about those things. But you, who are living in God's story, you don't have to worry about that. Why? God knows your needs. And because you are living as he has created you to live, you can rest assured that he will care for you. You don't need to be distracted. You can be set free to live fully into his story. In other words, Jesus says this, an outward look at God's care for his beloved creation and your exalted purpose in it will set you free from a smaller story perspective. So how do you escape the smaller story perspective? Upward look, ask God. Outward look, look at the birds and the flowers. Thirdly, take an inward look. How was Elijah's servant personally impacted by God's answered prayer? What do you think it did for him?
Rocked his world.
Yeah, rocked him. It's like, whoa, I never knew this was here. I think one of the things it did was it caused him to see himself differently. You see, he no longer viewed himself as a victim in a hostile world, but watch, he now saw himself as a character in God's story that's being told in a hostile world. There's a big difference. He went from seeing himself as a victim of his present situation in a hostile world to a character in God's story that's being told in a hostile world. The hostility doesn't go away, but how you see it changes, right? Question. Why is identifying ourselves as a character in God's story crucial to living in God's story? In other words, what I'm suggesting here, unless we begin to see ourselves primarily as a character in God's story, we won't be able to live in God's story. If we see ourselves as a victim of the present situation or anything else, we're not going to escape our smaller story perspective. So, why is identifying ourselves as a character in God's story crucial? What do you think? The reason is because how we identify ourselves will always determine the point of your story. Okay? For example, in our culture today, our identity is established by an identifier. And that identifier then determines the point of our story. A baby boomer. A baby boomer or a millennial or a Generation Z or whatever it might be, that's an identity, right? Those identities are established by certain traits. Baby boomers have certain traits, Gen Z have certain traits, etc. That determines the point of your story. What's the point of your story if you are living as a baby boomer or a Gen Z, if that's how you identify yourself? Well, you're part of the tribe. The tribe becomes the point. If you identify as gay, that is established by an identifier, which are sexual desires. If that's your identity, what then becomes the point of your story? Fulfillment. Why? Because the point of desire is that they be fulfilled, right? If you're an alcoholic, the identifier is the dysfunction caused by alcohol. If you're a codependent, the identifier is the dysfunction caused by living with an alcoholic. That determines the point of your story, which is recovery. That's what my life is about, recovery. That's what my life is about, fulfillment. That's what my life is about, the tribe. If I am a survivor, say a cancer survivor, my identifier is disease. And what's the point of my story now as a cancer survivor? Healing. If my identity is that of a victim, it's established by the identifier. What's the identifier of a victim? Oppression. And if that is what my identity is, based on oppression, the point of my story is justice. Okay? You see how that works? Now, in other words, how we view ourselves always determines the point of our story. How do you primarily view yourself in your present situation? If you view yourself as a victim of it, what's your point going to be? Justice? Getting out of this? Getting relief? That'll be the point of your story. This means for your story to be lived into God's story, you must identify yourself as a character in God's story. But to identify yourself as a character in God's story, that will make God's story the point of your story. And when God is the point of your story, you will live your story from the context of His story. And when you live your life from the context of His story, the result will be you'll begin to see God's story in your present situation. You'll escape your present situation and you'll see something bigger. Guys, what's your present situation? How would it change if you no longer viewed yourself as a victim of it, but instead as a character in God's story? It doesn't change the circumstance, but it changes the context in which you see it. You will never escape seeing yourself as a victim when you identify as a victim. You'll only escape it when you identify, I am a character in God's story. There's something bigger going on that I do not see. God, show me. So I take an upward look. I take that outward look. I want to see how you're working in the world, God. I see how you're working with the birds and the flowers, how you're working here. And I take an inward look. I'm a character, not a victim. Something that you can do, that I do every evening, is this examine. It takes about 10 minutes, a review of the day. You can go to this app called Pray As You Go. And if you go there, just go there, go down to where it says, I think it says retreats and prayers or something like that. Click that, and it'll have a bunch of different things. Just slide over until you see examine, daily examine. Hit that, and then there's like 5 or 6 daily examines. I use each one, different one for every day of the week. And what that is, it's a 10-minute review of the day where you look back over the day to say, okay, I want to begin to practice seeing God in my day. And I want to begin to see how I interacted with him in the day. So I'm constantly looking back. And as you form that practice, you create a habit of what? Seeing yourself as a character in God's story. You start looking for God in your life. And you start seeing yourself as a character. You got to do more than just take notes here, guys, and say, oh, that's a good idea. You got to begin to form a practice. This is a good way to start. So then, to exchange an unhealthy story for God's story, we got to do 3 things. Number 1, rethink our understanding of the Christian life. Recognize our present situation as part of something bigger. And we're going to take a 5-minute break and come back and finish up with the 3rd. Okay? So we said that to exchange an unhealthy story for God's story, we got to do 3 things. First of all, rethink our understanding of the Christian life and Christianity. Second, recognize our present situation as part of something bigger. And thirdly, as we bring this now to an end, we need to begin to learn to reinterpret our past experience from God's larger story context. What do I mean by that? Well, what this will look like is something like this. When we live in our smaller story, we will naturally interpret our past from the context of being its main character. How does my past affect me and the plot that I have for my life, the agenda that I have for my life as its main character? And as I operate as the main character and I look at everything that has happened to me in my past, I will form a certain belief about things based on me being the main character of the story. And what it will do is it will shape my beliefs about God, about pain, and about people based on how they impact the agenda that I have for my story as the main character. Okay? In other words, if God doesn't, if my plot is, just say it's just to have a happy life. And my life hasn't been happy. Things have been happening that are bad. So it's going to shape how I view God. Well, maybe God isn't so good, or maybe God isn't here, or maybe God doesn't care for me. It will shape how I view pain. Well, pain is always a bad thing, and it's something that I have to avoid, and it's something that I have to deny, because if I acknowledge it, I don't know what to do. Or people. People, they're not living for me. I can be demanding from this person, or this person should come through for me, and because they're not, then I'm going to divorce them, or I'm going to defriend them, or whatever it might be. When we live as the main character in our story, it will impact how we interpret the past. Okay? Now, when we begin to bring our smaller story into God's story, living in God's story means we will begin to reinterpret our past from the context not of a main character, but from the context of what? A supporting character, because we are no longer the main character. Who is the main character? God. And it's not about our plot and our agenda, but it's about what? Participating with God to bring about His agenda, to seek first the kingdom and His righteousness. That's His agenda. And when we do that, it will begin to reshape our beliefs about God, pain, and people based on how they impact God's story, not mine. Now, our past doesn't change, but the context or the lens from which we see them will change. We're not living out of the context or the lens of a main character. We're living out of the context and lens of a supporting character in God's story. Okay? Does that make sense? And what I'm saying is this. For us to live into God's story, it's necessary to live as this supporting character, to have that switch from main character to supporting character. Because it goes from living for my agenda to living for God's agenda. And in 1 Corinthians that we looked at 9 there, that was Paul, what Paul was saying. I'm not living for my agenda, I'm living for God's agenda. He's the point, not me. And because that's what I want to live for, I'm going to learn. I'm not going to just get in this race and swing it wildly in the air and run not to win. I'm going to win. I'm going to be about God's story. And that means I'm going to be a character in his story. So he identified himself like that. So why is this necessary? Here's another tack to take. We can't begin to live into God's story without first embracing the reality that from your very birth, from the day that you were born, God has been authoring your story. In other words, God isn't just out there, here's my story, and hope you'll be part of it. But God has been working in the world through human history, but also in the authoring of your story so that your story and his story can mesh. We cannot begin to live into God's story and face our past without first embracing the reality that from your very birth, God has been authoring your story. Now here's a question. If that's true, then how do we begin to reinterpret our past? What do we do? Answer? We have to begin by asking this question. How has God authored your story up to this point in your life? From the day you were born to right now, today, in your present situation, how has God been authoring your story? It's a question we all need to ask. But I want you to note something. This isn't an easy question to ask, is it? Why?
A lot of crap in my story.
There's a lot of crap in your story.
I lied to myself.
We lie to ourselves, we're self-deceptive. You see, all this, the moment we ask that question, it opens the door to the problem of divine sovereignty, if he authoring this, and free will. What part do I play? What part do other people play? Is there a difference? Is there free will? Is there divine sovereignty? It all gets really confusing, doesn't it? That's why we often don't ask these questions. It's just easier to think of Christianity as forgiveness and heaven when I die, and the Christian life is just being good and waiting to get there. Yeah. Put another way, how do the decisions you and others have made that have negatively shaped your story square with a good God's sovereign authorship of your story? How does that work? Before answering that, I want you to remember just one thing. Okay? Remember this. Because we are finite, fallen men, we are limited in our ability to see the actions and movements of an unseen God in our visible lives. We can't see him clearly, can we? And neither can we. We have a limited understanding of the reasons and purposes of a sovereign God in our past tragedies and all the bad things that have happened. In other words, I can't see God clearly and I can't understand God clearly. Why? Because I'm very limited, not only as a creature, but as a fallen creature. My mind has been corrupted. I don't see clearly. I don't understand clearly. And as a result, our limitations make it hard to honestly believe in a good God's sovereign authorship of our story. I mean, guys, if we're really honest, it's hard to acknowledge that God is good and He's fully authored everything that's gone on in my life. How do you square that? Your past and the things people have done to you, what the world has done to you, what you've done to yourself, and God's good authorship. He's writing a good story, overall and individually in each of our lives. 1 Corinthians 12, Paul acknowledges this. He says, all we can see of God now, today, right now, is like a cloudy reflection in a mirror. He says later, there's a time coming later we will see face to face. We'll see it all clearly. He says we don't understand everything now, but later again, there's a time coming at the end of the story, we will understand everything just as God completely understands us now. God understands us now. He's not foggy about us like we are with Him. But there's a day coming when we will see and understand clearly. But until now, guess what? We don't see very clearly. We don't understand very clearly. And so our theological limitations make it hard to believe a good and sovereign God has been authoring our story from the birth till today. So what do? Well, we can deny our limitations as men and blame God for our past, deny God's presence in our present, and throw stones at our future. A lot of men do. And in doing so, we will live an unhealthy story outside the context of God's story. Or we can acknowledge our limitations and wrestle with God over our past, like Job did. We can look for God's presence in our present, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Remember when they wouldn't bow their knee to the idol and they said, you sure you want to do this because you're going to get thrown into the fiery furnace? And what did they say? Well, God has the power. He's here and He sees what's going on and He can deliver us and He may not deliver us. We don't know what God's going to do. He's sovereign. He can make His choices. But we're not going to bow. They understood that God wasn't far off. They knew that God was present in the present. And we can lean into the future as a good future, like Paul did when he said, you know what, all these tragedies, all the suffering that's going on are not comparable to the future God has in store for those who love Him in Christ Jesus. So we can deny our limitations, or we can acknowledge them. And as we acknowledge them, we can live a healthy life, a healthy story within the context of God's story, wrestling with God, looking for God's presence, and leaning into the future. Now, if you choose the latter, not deny your limitations, but to acknowledge your limitations, then the question that you're going to have to ask yourself this morning is this. As a limited man, how do I honestly reinterpret my past based on the actions of a God I can neither see nor understand? In fact, if I look back at my past, everything in my past screams out that God is either sovereign or He is good, but He can't be both. I look at my past and I can see Him as sovereign, but He can't be good. Or I can look at my past and see Him as good, but He then can't be sovereign. But God being sovereign and God being good, that doesn't compute. How do I honestly reinterpret my past based on the actions of a God I can neither see or understand? Answer? By learning, by being open to learn from the stories of other limited but honest men who have learned to interpret their past from within God's story. There are other guys who have learned to do this, guys. And I think as we learn from them, we can be changed. A lot of stories in the Bible. One that we're probably most familiar with is the story of Joseph, Genesis 37 through 50. Who was Joseph? Well, Joseph was the son of Jacob and Rachel. He was the youngest of 11 brothers, Jacob's 11th son, Rachel's first son. Remember, Jacob was married to Leah and Rachel. And what is the setting? Every story has a setting. Well, remember, because he was the firstborn of the woman that he really loved, Rachel, he was his father's favorite. And that made his brothers jealous, especially when the father gave him the coat of many colors. And it didn't help that Joseph had all these dreams about him being better than everybody else, and he went around not keeping those dreams to himself, but what did he do? He shared those stories with everybody. And that created conflict, and the conflict came in the form of his brother's betrayal. They sell him into slavery, and then they take that coat of many colors, put blood on it, and tell the father what? Your favorite son is dead. That then creates the whole tension that moves the plot forward. And what's the tension? What will now happen to Joseph and his dreams? And the dreams were about what God was going to do in his life. Well, the plot is this. God fulfills the dreams through more betrayals. Joseph is a good guy, but every time he's faithful and good, what happens? He gets the rug pulled out from him again and again and again. And so God fulfills the dreams in the midst of betrayal, in spite of Joseph's loyalty. And what's the good ending? Well, the ending is this. God raises up Joseph to not give Joseph a good life, but to advance God's story by preserving who? Abraham's family. And why is that important to God's story? Because it's out of God's story that God is using Abraham's family to bring forth the Messiah, who will bring the whole world back to God, and through him, the new creation will be made. So God is working through Joseph, through his suffering and betrayals, to preserve the good story of God. Now, how did Joseph view his tragic past? Well, Joseph, if we look in the scripture, and we will here in a second, was able to reconcile his brother's evil actions, which brought him great harm, selling him into slavery, with both God's good and sovereign authorship of his story, Joseph's story, preserving the family by raising him to power. And we see this in two passages. First, Genesis 45, verses 4 through 5, he says this. He's talking to his brothers. He says, "And now do not fear or be angry with yourselves." Do not fear or be angry with yourselves about what? That you did this to me. That you sold me here, but God sent me before you to preserve life. Notice what they did, what God did. Again, Genesis 50, verse 20. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. Notice, what you did, evil. What God did, good. Now watch. Joseph didn't say, it was God's plan to comfortably send me down to Egypt, but your actions messed up God's plan regarding how I got here. He doesn't say that, does he? Joseph didn't see his brothers' evil actions as something God incidentally decided to use to accomplish his intended plan. In other words, well, they did this, and I'll just piggyback onto this, and I'll get Joseph down to Egypt like this. He didn't see it like that. And neither did Joseph think that his brothers' actions were not evil. Well, they were okay because they were used by God for good. Don't worry about it. No big deal. Why? Well, it was used for good anyway. What does Joseph do? Joseph believed that God was sovereignly working for good, and the brothers choosing to do evil were contained in the exact same event. In other words, when facing his tragic past, Joseph believed that God's sovereignty and goodness and man's free will to choose were two sides of the same coin again. The same event, two sides of the same coin. Different things, but two sides of the same coin. Peter believed the same thing. In Acts 4, verses 27-28, he prays this. O God, Herod and Pilate met together with the Gentiles and the people of Israel in this city to conspire against your holy servant Jesus, your anointed one. They did what your power and will had decided beforehand should happen. God's sovereignty, their free will. What do we see? The same criminal act that human beings committed against Jesus is the same redemptive act God was sovereignly authoring through Jesus. You see that? There's no distinction. Two sides of the same coin. Now, what do we learn from this? From Joseph's story and from Peter's prayer? Neither Joseph nor Peter tries to explain how God's sovereignty and man's free will can exist simultaneously in the same event. They just what? Assume they can and assume they do. But for them to do that, for sovereignty and free will to exist simultaneously requires that both men fully embrace something that you and I really hate. You know what it is? Mystery. Mystery. What's mystery? Well, God gives us a good definition of mystery in Deuteronomy 29:29. He says, the Lord our God has secrets known only to Him. We are not accountable for those secrets that God has, that only He knows, but we and our children are accountable for all that He has revealed to us so that we may obey His instructions. What's He saying here? He's saying that God alone possesses all knowledge of all reality. God knows everything. Now, God knows everything, and in that complete knowledge, there are some aspects of reality that He reveals to us through creation and Scripture. God reveals things to Himself through creation and through the Bible. This is called revelation. And what God chooses to reveal to us, He says we are accountable to it and we are to obey it. We are responsible for what God reveals and we need to do what God reveals. But He says there's something else. There are other aspects of reality that He withholds from us for undisclosed purposes. He doesn't tell us why. He just doesn't give us everything. What does He say we're to do with that? That's called mystery not revelation. Mystery is what we can know. Revelation is what we don't know. But we are to respond to that not with a sense of accountability or obedience, but with humility and faith. I have limitations. I don't know everything. God knows everything. He's good. He's sovereign. And I have to trust what? That He is good and sovereign when things make no sense. This means when we honestly ask, how has God authored my story up until this point, from birth to today? Two things are going to happen to you when you ask that question. First of all, you're going to bump hard into mystery. Boom. And it ain't going to be a little fender bender. It's going to be a total. Second, when you bump hard into mystery, you'll feel fully disrupted. Guess why? Because mystery doesn't budge. You just hit it. And it doesn't make sense. And it doesn't give you reasons why. And we're left with the question, when we ask honestly, this: how could my past hurts and tragedies ever been authored by a good and sovereign God? That's a question that we all have to ask. But that's a scary question, isn't it? It is a disruption. It disrupts us, but it's a necessary and dangerous question to ask if we're going to live into the story of God. Why is it dangerous to ask this question? How could a good and sovereign God really author my story?
Because we may hate the answer.
The danger lies in how we respond to the answer we give it.
It stretches us.
You see, there are some ways that we can respond. There are 4 responses to mystery. Number 1, we can become angry at God and bitter at life. I don't like mystery. I want an answer. I demand an answer. Isn't fair. Or we can deny the unresolved parts of our past. Oh, they just never happened. I'm okay. Or we can pretend about our past, calling good what God never would call good. Oh yeah, what you did it wasn't bad because God used it for good. And any one of these 3 responses, guys, are the marks of an unhealthy story. Angry, bitterness, denial, pretense. Those are all the marks of an unhealthy story. And if you're living an unhealthy story, guess what? You can't live into God's larger story. There's a 4th response to mystery, and that is this: to humbly embrace it. You don't have to like it, but you embrace it by learning to see over time with the eyes of faith. And when you do, it places your story inside the context of God's story, right along with Joseph's story, Peter's story, and Elisha's servant's story. Now, again, this is easier said than done, and so while, I want to give you a tool that examine to help you see God's story by looking at end of your day, this is a tool I think I put together several years ago. It's about 30 pages, and you can get it on our website, and it's a tool for rethinking your past. For rethinking your past in light of the idea, if God really is the author of my story, how do I embrace that given what has gone on in my past? If you're really wanting to live honestly, and if you really are willing to face that disruption that bumping into mystery brings, this might help you to live into that with humility and trust. It'll take time to work through this, and something you're going to work through within an hour. I think we did it originally on a weekend for our men's groups leaders, and it took the whole weekend. And so you can get that on the website. I would encourage you to pick that up. Because until you're willing to be able to see your story no longer as the main character, but the supporting character, and then be able to reinterpret your past, you're not going to be able to live into God's story. But to do that, you'll bump headlong into mystery, and it will disrupt you. And so what have we seen today? If we're going to have a healthy story, we must learn to live into God's story. To live into God's story, we got to do three things. Number one, rethink our understanding of Christianity and the Christian life. Number two, recognize our present situation as part of something bigger. And lastly, reinterpret our past experience from God's larger story context. Now, the question is, where do we go from here? Well, where we go from here begins next February. What on earth is God doing? And what we're going to do is we're going to take all what we've talked about God's story and living into God's story and the Christian life and participating, and we're going to talk about what that means in light of the spiritual battle, reframing the spiritual battle in light of God's story. Because when we do, it's going to change how you see the spiritual battle. It's going to change how you see evangelism. It's going to change how you see discipleship. It's going to change how you see the church. It's going to change how you see the world. I am more excited about teaching this next series than any series I've been going to teach. But we're going to begin it in February, and hopefully you'll be here for that. Well, with that, I'm going to let Dan come up